It's April the 7th, 2022. This is 508, a show about Worcester. How are you doing there?
Fantastic, Michael. How are you?
I could be doing better, but I'm doing okay.
Yeah, I'm lying as well. I'm miserable. I still have lingering COVID symptoms, and the whole world is falling apart. But yeah, for the purpose of the show, I'm doing great.
Well, and for the purpose of the show, things going on in the world is actually, I guess, a good thing because it gives us stuff to talk about. Since the last show, there has been a ton of Worcester news, and I'll just cover 3 of the headlines here quick at the top of the show, but there are many more headlines than this that are worth talking about. For me, the top headline is that our most powerful local public official has announced his retirement, his resignation. And this is the public official who, I would say that this is, of all of our local public officials, the one who I respect the most in terms of how they carry out their official job. I am speaking, of course, of Judge Timothy Hillman, our local U.S. Federal District Court judge in Worcester, out of the federal courthouse downtown. And he's retiring in July. He is going to be, I don't want to get into the details of his post-retirement situation because it makes me realize how complicated judging is and how little I understand the judicial system.
And this is the gentleman who, Eric Batista, is going to be stepping in as acting federal court judge.
Well, that's the second thing, which is that our city manager, whose name is escaping me at the moment, is stepping down and will be replaced at least temporarily by Assistant City Manager Eric Batista. That is what it is. We should talk about that a lot longer. The third big headline for me is that Billy Riley, who for many years has run the St. John's Soup Kitchen in Worcester, has been put on leave while an investigator looks into public allegations that he coerced women who were using the soup kitchen into sex. Nothing really has come out about this since the first week, I guess, that it was a story in the news. Yeah. But I think it's a big story. It's certainly a story that people talk to me a lot about.
Sure.
It's a story about which I have no secret information about this. So, as with many crime stories that we cover, I don't know that there's anything I can particularly add, but I just want to put it out there. Judge Hillman is stepping down. He was. How
many times were you in front of Judge Hillman?
So I was in front of Judge Hillman 2 times.
Okay.
The first time was in 2008. A group of 5 of us, as sort of part of an extension of this Lenten vigil that we were doing at the downtown courthouse and praying for the end of the Iraq War and thinking, well, the Iraq War is a federal thing and the federal courthouse is a federal thing. So this is a good place to pray outside of. To kind of wrap up Lent, we went inside the lobby to pray the rosary. And we were eventually told to stop doing this and arrested. And we were charged with 2 petty offenses. One was blocking the entrance, and one was not doing what a federal officer tells you to do, not following the lawful order of a federal officer. And I think it was marshals in that case saying, "Hey, get out of this lobby."
Who, by the way, have the best parking situation in the city of Worcester. There's so much of downtown Worcester around that courthouse that is U.S. Marshals parking only. And,
is that right?
Oh, yeah. If you're a U.S. Marshal and you don't realize how much you could rent out your parking space to for the newly densely populated downtown area.
So Hillman at the time was, I think, what they call a magistrate judge, which is kind of like the junior judge in a U.S. district court. So the magistrate judge is handling routine stuff, I guess, kind of. In this case, I'm sure that they were like this silly thing where these 5 people are accused of petty offenses, like sub misdemeanor offenses, I think. Right. Federal offenses, but sub misdemeanor offenses is not something that we're going to actually tie up the federal court in Worcester with. So we're going to give this to the magistrate judge to handle. And we had a little case in front of him. We represented ourselves, and we were acquitted of blocking the entrance because video evidence shows that we were not blocking the entrance, or at least not attempting to. But we, in fact, did not do what we were told to do, so we were found guilty of that. We were all given $250 fines, and 3 of us paid the fines, and a couple of us, just as part of this sort of civil disobedience-ness of this all, decided to resist the fines. And I think we're eventually given community service.
Okay.
But they had a couple of more hearings. The second time that I was in front of Judge Hillman was this past October when I did federal jury duty in Worcester. I don't think I've talked about this on the show. This was a great experience. So my experience doing this was very, very brief. You go into the federal courthouse, and there's probably, 50 people in the jury pool.
Wait a second, Mike. I don't mean to cut you off.
Yeah.
But you're telling me that you can be a criminal in the eyes of the federal court system and still serve on jury duty?
Oh, I'm telling you that you can't do this, but I'm going to tell you. But I mean, I was paid for a day of jury duty. So you go in there, they seat everybody in whatever you call the audience part of the courtroom. And there's like 50 people in there. And like I'm wearing, of course, a suit and tie. Maybe one other person is wearing a tailored jacket. Maybe one other person is wearing a tie. Everybody else is kind of dressed like they've just been working on their car. My friend Abdul actually was called into the same jury, neither of us knowing this. And Abdul was wearing the most ratty, like tie-dyed shirt that he had. He literally had a giant copy of Das Kapital that he was reading while we were waiting around. So you wait around a long time, and then eventually they're like, "Hey, we have a case coming up, and it's going to be a drug case." And so
what you're saying in painting this picture is that this is a room full of professionals when it comes to avoidance of jury duty.
I don't know. I mean, I think that people are just kind of, I mean, people in this country are generally sort of cash. And I don't think that there's anybody who's like, I'm going to wear my Sunday best to go to jury duty.
Yeah.
Because for most people, I'm sure that they don't really want to even be in this room. It's just a big inconvenience. So anyway, so you get up there and the judge says, "Hey, like, here's the defendants." I think the defendants were in the courtroom. They brought them in at least briefly, and they were like, "If anybody, like, we want to make sure nobody knows these guys." And then, he had a list of questions that I think is basically him. This is sort of the voir dire part of this. I think it's like him and the prosecutor and the defense attorney kind of have a consensus on here's the questions we're going to ask. So he's like, who in here has a history of drug addiction for themselves or their immediate family? And people raise their hands and they're like, oh, it's juror 8 and juror 14. And they kind of write these down. And then they're like, who in here has history in law enforcement themselves or their immediate family? Oh, it's juror 52 and juror whatever and juror whatever. And then eventually they're like going down the list and they're like, all right, maybe they're drawing it randomly. I don't know. They're like, juror number 8, you stand up for briefly, like you said you had a couple of these things. You raised your hand for a couple of these things. Is this true? And they're like, yes. And like, then you approach the bench. And as one of these articles notes here, like instead of playing white noise to sort of cover over these kind of conversations, Hillman really likes to play Rolling Stones in particular, but classic rock in general.
Fantastic.
So it is a good playlist. It was a good playlist. I feel like it was not what you would think of as sort of a real dad rock playlist. It was a little broader and a little nicer than that. But yeah, so you would sort of go up there. So they call me up there because I raised my hand for a ton of these things. One of them, of course, is like, have you ever been convicted of a crime? So I go up there, and it's like Hillman and the clerk and a couple of the attorneys, and they're like, let's just kind of go down through the list. So they're like, okay, like law enforcement, like what's that about? And I'm like, well, my father was a military policeman in Vietnam. I don't know if that counts. And Hillman's like, oh, it definitely counts. Okay. And then they're like, and what about like being convicted of a crime? And I'm like, I don't know if you remember this, but about like, I don't even know how many, what was 13 years ago or something. Like I was in here and I was on trial for, praying the rosary and he's like, you guys. And he really remembered a lot of the details. I think because the defendants sort of had these two different, conclusions, like some people had to pay the fine and some people had to like do the community service. He was a little bit confused about like what I had been sentenced to, but he remembered it in great detail. He remembered it slightly better than I did in terms of the technicalities. So I was like, I don't know if that's like it's like a petty offense. So I don't know if that's a federal crime. He's like, oh, it's definitely a federal crime. Yeah. And it was very nice. It reminded me of his behavior when he was the judge of our case, which is that he, to the extent that you can be kind, he was kind. He was very clear. He was very relaxed, very fair. So when he's from Chicago, I think originally, and then moved to Massachusetts when he was a teenager, went back to the Midwest for college, and then came back here and was like an assistant district attorney for a while. Then he was like the lawyer for various cities and towns in Worcester County for a long time. Then he was like a judge. Then I think that to become the magistrate judge, maybe the federal judges vote on you to do this. Okay. So there was like an opening for this. So the local federal judges I believe voted him to become a magistrate judge. And then when there was an opening for a district judge, or a main judge or whatever. Again, I don't know what these things are called. This is when Obama, in this case, in 2011, I believe, nominates him as a United States district judge for the District of Massachusetts. And this is a question that Senator Grassley asked him during this hearing, which I thought was a good, I thought this was a good answer. What's the most important attribute of a judge, and do you possess it? And Hillman says, I believe that the most important attribute of a judge is respect. Respect for oneself, respect for the litigants and lawyers who appear before the court, and most importantly, respect for the laws as they're enacted by Congress and interpreted by the First Circuit and Supreme Court. I believe that I possess this attribute. And I think that this is accurate. Like this just feels like the kind of boilerplate that any of us would say, I think, if we went in front of the Senate to try to get confirmed as a district court judge. But that was certainly my experience of him.
I'm just looking over this list of questions, and I don't see where he was asked if he believes babies can be racist.
Well, I mean, he is asked about, like, is he willing to follow Supreme Court precedents? And he says, yes, I am, which is a sort of a funny thing. So, I mean, to the extent that the Supreme Court can set him a precedent on that. I mean, and I'll say this, like, I mean, Hillman, to some extent, you are the representative of a very imperfect system. So to a certain extent, doing your job there, you're going to be doing things which are, imperfect.
Yeah.
But as far as to the extent to which you can do a good job in a situation like that, I think he did I think again, from my two experiences, he did a great job. And by the way, I was of course not called onto jury duty. Or I would, they after your little interview, they like put you in the jury box, and then they kind of talk for a minute, and then they're like, yeah, why don't you just go sit down? Or why don't you go home, or whatever. And then what you do is every Friday afternoon, you call the court, and a little automated answering thing will say, yes, we have a new trial starting on Monday, or no, we don't. And in the month of October, there was no other trials starting. So every Friday, it would say, don't bother coming back on Monday. And then you get paid $50 for spending a couple hours one morning down there.
Well, congratulations, Judge Hillman. And since you clearly have an in, we should try and see if we can get Judge Hillman on this show.
I was reminded of what a personable guy Judge Hillman is, just talking to him this most recent time. Again, and I was very surprised, but the level of detail in which he remembered this very minor and goofy civil disobedience case from so long ago. He is going to become a senior judge, and again, I don't understand really the differences between any of these things. So, senior judges, I think, it seems it's like what people normally do whenever they quote retire. So you're going to be down there sometimes. Maybe you have a reduced caseload. And maybe you're going to be a little bit more like a magistrate judge and dealing with less important stuff. Maybe you're not. I don't know. But we will be getting a new district judge in the federal courthouse starting this summer when Hillman steps aside / steps down, however you want to play it. Anyway. Yeah,
congratulations! Always
happy to talk about him on the show. And again, it was nice. It was a nice jury duty. Yeah, to the extent that I did it. The second thing on our list, of course, is that the city manager, Edward Augustus.
You did remember his name.
The very august Edward Augustus is stepping down, and there's been a lot of
less notice than your average Taco Bell employee.
Yeah, like in some sense, there's been a lot less hue and cry than there should have been, but at least they delayed the process by a week, so I feel like there was able to be maybe an adequate level of hue and cry, or an adequate level of public discussion over the process of replacing him. I mean, there is no hearing in which a senator's quiz him. By the way, Hillman approved by a vote of 88-1, with Senator Mike Lee casting the sole no vote.
Someone's got to say no.
Yeah.
Looks bad if you get a unanimous vote.
Yeah. So, so there's Timothy Hillman.
Was that Augustus voted in as city manager with a unanimous vote? Do we know?
I don't even remember. I mean, it was a fix. It didn't matter whether it was a unanimous vote or not. So you watched the city council meeting this week. What went on with Assistant City Manager Eric Batista becoming the temporary replacement city manager?
The things that stood out to me were, one, and I think it had a lot to do with some of the conversations that likely took place behind the scenes after that 1 week hold. The language was changed. So initially, Mr. Batista was going to be brought in as an interim city manager. And as we all discussed ad nauseum back when City Manager Augustus was brought in on an interim basis, the word interim doesn't actually exist in our charter. there's just no there's no room for that in the city. But at the same time, because it's not listed there doesn't necessarily mean you couldn't do it that way. It's not actually the way it's laid out.
I don't know if we want to get this deep into the weeds.
No.
Is the word interim or acting being used in like just sort of a general descriptive way, or there's a specific position
I think
called
that's
the acting city manager?
That's ultimately the problem, is that our charter, sometimes it seems like it was written by toddlers who had a pretty good understanding of the English language, but didn't necessarily cobble it together as well as they could have. So, yeah, when in the absence of a city manager, the charter reads that you're supposed to have an acting city manager who is a city hall employee, and then it sort of indicates that that person should not be considered for the permanent job. Initially, it was suggested that Mr. Batista was going to be brought in as an interim. The mayor then changed his order at some point in time to label him acting. It's not entirely clear whether or not the mayor realizes that by that changing that one word, maybe Eric isn't now eligible to be a full-time, long-term city manager. I mean, I'm sure the legal department will figure a way to suss that out when the time is right.
That charter language seems so half-assed. Yeah. I'm sure that none of it would stand up at least not in Judge Hillman's court, let me tell you.
The thing that is, I guess, as everything came together throughout the night, there actually were a lot of rather pressing matters in front of the council that night. Community Preservation Act, the Denholm building being taken by eminent domain and sold off to the WRA and the Business Development Corp. The one thing that really stood out to me throughout the night was the number of councillors who basically, or I guess specifically identified Eric as being the only person who could ever possibly do this job. Yeah. But then throughout the course of the night, I think he might have been the only person who works in the manager's office, maybe Nicole Valentine as well, who didn't speak to some extremely pressing issue, right? Like you had people like Peter Dunn coming up and speaking for a half hour about the process of taking the Denholm building and all the intricacies of that. Yeah. Nobody heard from Eric the entire night. It was actually at the end of the meeting, Councillor King, just off book, asked, like, can we just hear from the guy? And he came up and spoke for a little bit. I mean, nothing really stood out that much. I feel like this is one of those things, we were talking a little bit before the show. I think it's easy for people to jump, from my perspective, for people to jump to the idea that everything is a big conspiracy and like the fix is in sort of thing. I don't really see it that way at all. I feel like whenever we go through this process, because it's not well-charted territory and it's never really been fleshed out in an ideal format, you kind of end up with like rebooting the same movie franchise over and over, right? Mm. It's just Doctor Who. The big question is like, who's going to play Doctor Who and who's going to be the accessory characters and whatnot. There was a lot of talk that was very similar to when City Manager Augustus was brought in, when Mike O'Brien was brought in, when Tom Hoover was brought in, when Jeff Mulford was brought in. It's almost like every councillor, even though they may not have been there in the 90s, carried over the exact same concerns that somebody sitting in that exact same seat 20 years earlier had. And to me, that's the interesting stuff. Is not, and again, I don't think at all that it's a big insidery conspiracy. I just think it's just a limited focus on who can fill this role, if it's going to be somebody local, and the types of conversation that need to surround the appointment, which from a local perspective tend to be things like development and, are we going to make developers happy? Are we going to keep economic growth moving in the city and whatnot? Which oftentimes it ends up having a very insular sort of provincial kind of take to it seems.
I have a new theory of the city manager, but I'm not going to say it today because it's kind of long. But this is just a little teaser for the next episode of 508. I'll explain my new theory of the Worcester city manager. I feel like a lot of the concerns that I see, I think, come down to the fact that the mayor and whoever else kind of mislead people, or at least allow people to be misled, that they say, here is this person, they're just going to be the temporary city manager. In the case of Ed Augustus, literally signs a piece of paper saying, I will never be the permanent city manager. And then they have this search, and they don't go into the search. I think if you started the search off and you were like, hey, Mike O'Brien, the guy we got in here, the best guy we're going to get. Ed Augustus, the guy we got in here, the best guy we're going to get. But we're willing to look. We're going to look for some other people just in case we're wrong, and then come out of that search being like, nah, didn't like any of the other people that much. We're going to stick with our initial pick. That's kind of not how they do it. There's a little bit. There's a little bit more of a vibe of like, this is a temporary thing. We're going to do the search. The search is what's going to bring us the city manager.
Right.
And in both the last two city managers, the city manager did not come out of the search. The city manager came out of what felt like a fairly quick process of somebody being, who's around?
Yeah.
Eric Batista, Mike O'Brien. They can do the job. Great. Let's go. And so I think that if you went, and so again, I think that if you were like, hey, it's like hiring the clerk. It's like, we don't expect there to be like a 14-month search for the new Worcester clerk. It has to be somebody good, somebody who can do the job. But the idea that somebody from the clerk's office would be the new clerk is reasonable.
Sure.
That if the council were to be like, hey, the manager is just like a guy that works for us, it doesn't have to be like the greatest manager in America. Somebody who's in the council office right now is fine.
Right. And I think that's your point is the one that I think matters when it comes to how this process appears externally. Is that, well, on the one hand, I don't think anyone has suggested that Mr. Batista isn't the guy, right? But when it's this very narrow focus on, you've got the people sitting on the council saying that out loud that he's the only person they can imagine, as if they've already met everybody other potential candidate out there. It gives the appearance, and I don't think it's intentional, but it at least gives the appearance that the proverbial fix is in. When the reality is that, like, I think for the general public, nobody would suggest that Eric isn't the guy. But, if he's the guy, then he's the guy, whether you just pluck him out of the city manager's office or you have a stack of 1,000 applications. He's just going to be the one that comes to the top in this case. It's and that because there isn't really a well-fleshed out repetitive process as to how we go about this, you never just get to the point where you can say that, right? Like, it's just, if you're doing, if you're putting in a good faith effort to find the right individual for the job, even your in-house favorite stands a good chance of rising to the top if they're as good as you say they are. But sometimes it appears like we want to skip those other steps. The other concern that I, especially now in this job market, that I find personally concerning, also looking at the city and the number of openings, relatively high-level openings and very high-level openings in city government that we currently have from an employment perspective, there's no guarantee that anyone's even going to want the job, right? Like, we're in a really weird place from a job market perspective. I personally have zero idea what the availability of free agent city managers or people qualified for that role looks like right now. Somebody who's familiar with the office could be the best that we could possibly hope for, right? Like, it might be that like you and I end up applying for this job, and that would be a nightmare for the city if they could choose between one of us.
Do not hire me.
Either of us, please don't. But yeah, and we have no idea what, if we hire a search firm. That search firm could come back in 6 months and say, yeah, nobody's interested. Everyone's taken. Sorry.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it would even be reasonable for me if I heard the mayor say something at the end of the search process, like, every time we turn over a city manager, there's a certain level of chaos, waste of time, whatever that's happening. Maybe we find other people in the search who are as good as Eric. Not worth switching them out, though. Not worth like switching city managers just to get somebody who's as good, somebody who's 5% better, whatever. Not worth it. Like, the disruption is way worse. That feels like the kind of thing that they could never say. They could never make that argument. I don't know why I think they would never be willing to say something like that. But that also seems like a reasonable thing, that if this was like a privately held company or something, or a publicly held company, if this were like a for-profit corporation, you could totally imagine them being like, hey, we're not going to worry about we're not going to fire our CEO just because we think there's somebody who's 1% better out there.
Right. And I part of me thinks that that's, the more I've given it thought, part of me thinks that that's the way the conversation should be directed, is less about bickering over whether or not he's the right individual for the job, and more a focus on the known issues that are in front of him right now. Fired out of a cannon, you're going to be looking for a chief diversity officer. You're going to be looking for a chief cultural officer. There's a handful of holes within the manager's office itself, below the manager, in terms of assistant sort of roles, project managers, what have you. You're going to be on the back end of a superintendent search. You're going to be looking at a DPW that's down a significant number of engineers. You're going to be looking at inspectional services that's down a significant number of people. There's a lot of work. Like I almost wish the conversation was more like, let's all agree that you're really eager and really want this job because it's a big title and you're a young dude, and I'm sure that part of you is all excited. Do you have any idea how much work is in front of you right now? And are you perfectly clear in how much everybody in the city, or at least a significant number of people in the city, are going to hate you within a very short period of time because they're only going to see the flaws? They're not going to see the amount of hard work that's actually necessary into bringing the administration alone just a level, never mind keeping the whole city kind of level.
Should the conversation be about what a terrible job Ed Augustus has done? Because the situation you described does sound like a very challenging one to be dealing with. How is it that you allow this situation to occur and then you say, and now I'm resigning with all of this chaos?
So this is, I think this is also another fair conversation that we should be having, that we're almost not capable of having, because it's too easy to view us as, when we're talking about the city of Worcester, we're talking about the city as if it's in a bubble. And we're not special, right? Like the things that go on in Worcester, for the most part, go on in every community in the Commonwealth and every community in the country in some form. And these same challenges are in front of everybody. I think we all on the outside sometimes make it appear too easy, that there's easy solutions just hanging out there. And there's not. In the same way that people are leaving the teaching profession in droves, they're leaving the service sector in droves. They're leaving public service in general in droves. And that's not just a headache in Worcester. That's a headache in all 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts and across all 50 states in the United States, and I'm sure France. Like Canada probably has some issues on that front too, right? Like the challenges in terms of filling these roles, paying them appropriately, right? I mean, that was a bit of a mini scandal that came and went quickly last week, but when one of the local area publications published the pay scale for our chief diversity officers. And I mean, it is wildly low compared to the rest of the executive level positions in, and that sounds really easy, right? Like, well, if you want a good person who's going to stay there and is going to feel enabled and emboldened by the administration to do their job, pay them better. But then that's a whole nother conversation in Worcester that we don't like having, because, well, now there's money involved and somebody's going to pay for it. And that's in every role that we have. So yeah, just it's a really complex gig for anybody to be in. I can't imagine it's a lot of fun at the end of the day. Well, Eric, I wish you luck. Have fun with that.
Yeah, good luck.
It only took 2 days for George.
Looks like Brendan was interrupted there by a technical glitch. I'll just wrap it up with...
Not uncommon.
In commodities news, Brent crude oil is $103 a barrel, down 10% on the week and up 61% on the year, and up 83% over what it was 5 years ago. Bitcoin is $43,800, down 7% on the week and down 22% on the year. Today's Worcester Air Quality Index is 40 due to small particles, which is on the high side of the good range.
Terrible week for Bitcoin.
Brendan,
it was really just yesterday.
It's been good talking to you.
Pleasure as always, Mike. Take care.